Israel and Iran are finally at all-out war. What analysts have predicted, and many more have feared for decades, is reality. The entire of the Middle East is now engulfed in a conflict between two entities with the unequivocal desire to see the other's destruction. However, these events aren't and never do happen in a vacuum, and spillover effects are inevitable, leading to the question that what if this isn't the end, but just the beginning? Israel's unprecedented airstrike campaign against Iran has, in the eyes of many, left Tehran reeling. We've also learned a lot already from each side's ways of strikes. And while world leaders call for calm, we have to ask, what if those calls are essentially ignored? What if events drag the United States into another Middle East war? The Iranian regime collapses. And, well, a chain reaction is set off from as far from Riyadh to Moscow. All these questions and more is what I seek to cover in this emergency video.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going, everybody? Now, I appreciate the background might seem rather unusual, but as regular viewers will probably know, this program is a bit of a travelling podcast, and just being my luck, the single arguably biggest geopolitical escalation since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine happens to be unfolding as I'm in Rome. That being said, the severity of what we're seeing unfold before us necessitated a video, and I seek to aim to do that. Now, events have merely just begun, so I won't pretend that this video will remain indefinitely accurate nor is completely exhaustive in all the points. But my objective here is to provide an overview of potential scenarios and give you an idea of how things could play out, at least in the short term. Moreover, if you want to hear my raw takes about what we've seen so far, stick around to the end, including whether Russia could get involved, for example, and two particular important takeaways we've learned about Iran's position vis-a-vis Israel. Equally, as we get further into it, as we explore more of these themes, it's not exactly the kind of video YouTube's algorithm is going to love. So if you want more honest, straightforward breakdowns like this, then like the video and do consider subscribing. There'll be plenty more to come. Now let's start with the most dangerous possibility. The US is dragged in, and based on reports that we're seeing, the narrative rhetoric, the words coming out of Tehran, that seems like it's going to happen. The Iranians are threatening to target not just American, but British and French bases if they feel that the West is already too much supporting Israel or Israel just continues to strike. Iran believes that the US gave the green light to Israel's strikes, even if Trump and Washington did deny in the early hours of Israel's airstrike campaign. They subsequently shifted tone, with Trump suggesting that, well, this was day 61. After 60 days of sort of a timeline, Iran had to get a deal done with them over their nuclear program. So it seems that the US is shifting its own position on this. And if that belief is the case in Iran, then, well, Iran has options, and none of them are good. American forces are scattered across the Middle East, as you're probably aware, from special forces in Iraq to air bases, around 30,000 troops in Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, or UAE. Any of these could become targets. But if Iran feels compelled to do even more, the regime is about survival at the end of the day, then they could target even diplomatic missions or civilian contractors. Now imagine one American dies in Tel Aviv, or Baghdad, or Beirut. Trump, despite his no new wars promise, will face enormous, insurmountable pressure to respond. And to be honest, much of the United States intelligence/military communities do see this as an opportunity to finally break and topple Iran's regime. And only the US has the bunker-busting bombs the Israelis need that could destroy Iran's most fortified and deepest positioned nuclear sites, such as Fordow. And so if the US joins the fight directly, it's no longer a bilateral engagement between Israel and Iran. Now, for people who are more sympathetic to Iran's position, they argue that it isn't. The green lighting and tacit approval of the United States means the US is already in the war and therefore is a legitimate target under international law. It's proportionality. Others would argue that the tacit support of the US diplomatically or whatever is different to Iran directly targeting military targets. Scenario 2 is that Iran doesn't decide to target the United States directly, but they hit something like the Gulf. If Iran struggles to hit Israel directly, it may lash out at, say, softer targets nearby. The Gulf states seem quite applicable in this case, and they have been tacitly helping the Israelis through allowing the use of their airspace, for example. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Jordan. Iran has done it before. If you remember, in 2019, there was a set of drone strikes on Saudi oil fields, or the Houthis, one of Iran's remaining proxies, attacking Abu Dhabi in 2022. Now imagine it again, except with a regional war already underway, oil prices are spiking, and global supply chains still reeling from a pandemic and several other conflicts. These countries also do host US embassy air bases. So if they're attacked, well, they won't stay neutral. They'll want US jets in the sky for security assurances, which means, well, the US gets pulled in again. That's the whole relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States anyway. So the third scenario is, what if Iran doesn't just strike back? What if it decides the only way to survive is to build the bomb? The whole point of this is about nuclear proliferation in Iran. Let's not forget, Iran already has around 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to around 60%. That's just one step away below weapons grade, and enough for around estimations of 10 bombs. If the regime sees Israel's attacks as an existential threat, which increasingly they seem to do, the incentive to race towards nuclear capability increases tenfold. And here's the thing. Killing the nuclear scientists may slow the program, but you can't kill the knowledge that already exists. You can't kill expertise. In fact, this attack might convince Iran's military leaders, the IRGC and such, especially the more headstrong ones, now replacing those removed, that they must go for the bomb. And that opens the door to something even worse, a full-on regional arms race. If Iran begins and America's hesitating, then what does that mean for the Saudis, for the Qataris, for the Emiratis, the Jordanians? Do they just feel that they have to get their own nuclear weapons? We've seen this happening in North Korea with the South Koreans and Japanese feeling that they might need to get their own weapons if they cannot rely on the uncertainty or unpredictability of a Trump-led US. Scenario 4 is seemingly already underway as well, global economic shock. As the fighting escalates, so does the global impact. Oil prices are rising, but what if Iran tries to close the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which 20% of the world's oil passes? What if the Houthis in Yemen, one of Iran's proxies, as I say, steps up its own blockades and activity in the Red Sea shipping lane? Indeed, there is some speculation that they may be attempting to do this, a sort of two-pronged attack to close off these areas. The global economy would be absolutely, thrown into disarray. Add in oil shock, and we're looking at higher inflation, another cost of living spike, and billions more, most importantly, for Vladimir Putin's war machine, considering what the oil prices would do for Russia and its campaign in Ukraine. And so while the West suffers, the Kremlin profits. And you can see how the intricate connections of all these suddenly begin to emerge. Now, scenario 5 is that, the opposite, let's imagine, happens, and Israel succeed and Iran's regime falls. What if Operation Rising Lion, as this has become known, collapses the Iranian regime? To some in Israel, this is the ultimate victory. This is what this is about. Netanyahu has made no secret that regime change is the long-term game. It's the end game. But be careful for what you wish for. We've seen this story before. Iraq, Libya. The fall of one strong regime or despot doesn't guarantee peace. It guarantees potentially civil war, chaos, militias, refugee flows. A post-regime Iran could make the Syrian civil war look, somewhat orderly by comparison, and that's not downplaying the atrocities and events of the civil war in Syria. And if the vacuum is filled by someone even more extreme, or worse, if the nuclear material survives the regime, but now we've just got non-state actors running around freely as we did in the 2010s with ISIS. That's not liberation, that's catastrophe. Think of the film The Peacemaker, and, you get an independent group with extremist views running around with a nuclear bomb. The regime is not something desired by the Israelis or the Americans, but it's a known quantity in some ways versus something that could replace it, which is, an unknown. So think about how we got here. Israel's made claims that Iran has these nuclear ambitions, and it's true that Iran has been reaching those uranium levels well beyond the civilian. The debates between the US and Iran were not going anywhere, and it seems like the United States had reached a point of saturation. Trump was impatient and had effectively given up. And whether or not this was long standing in the pipeline, i.e. that the Israelis and the Americans planned this, it seems that the Israelis chose now to act for fear that things would only get worse, with the Iranians just dipping out of negotiations and pursuing the bomb. And so they decided to take the initiative. So what comes next? Well, Trump says Iran, quote unquote, has a second chance to make a deal. And some people speculate, is this sort of a stick and carrot scenario? Hit them hard and then negotiate afterwards. But Israel's strikes may have sabotaged the very talks meant to contain Iran's programs beyond repair. And if Iran's regime survives this assault, it may conclude that the only way to get its self-survival is the bomb. That in turn would push, as I said, a ripple effect from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, maybe even Egypt seeking their own nukes. From a surgical strike to a regional arms race, it's all in the space of weeks. And to my mind, though, we talk about this being World War III in some people's cases, I don't necessarily see it like this. America could get pulled in, yes, but the question remains with the Russians. In my opinion, it seems unlikely. The Russians are overstretched as it is in Ukraine. They have very little capacity, bandwidth to defend their own airspace, as we've seen from the countless incursions by Ukraine and now Operation Spiderweb. Moreover, the Russians are not going to risk their own military assets like aircraft over Iran. Iran is an incredibly important strategic partner, but well, if it comes between your own survival and the upholding of another regime, you're not going to pick the latter. That's why we saw the Iranians not come to the aid of Hezbollah or Syria. Then, of course, some people wonder about China. Some of the comments coming out of Pakistan are quite interesting. Their unequivocal support for Iran is very clear, but is that at the behest of Beijing or simply because Pakistan is a bit of a pariah state in its current format? China seems to me a bit of an enigma, and I would be rather surprised if they chose to get more involved kinetically, perhaps diplomatically or through supplies, or non-lethal aid as they call it. But to get involved serves no real strategic advantage for Beijing. They have their own focuses on the east, and keep in mind that whilst the Russians, the Iranians are more reckless, the Chinese benefit from the prevailing system, even if they want to see the United States no longer the global hegemon. So whilst Russia, I'm pretty confident, wouldn't get more involved, at least kinetically, China is an enigma, but I still feel it's unrealistic. And then, from what we've seen, Iran does seem to be on the back foot rather clearly. The gaps between their rounds of strikes illustrates that they don't seem to have the bandwidth either to overwhelm Israeli air defenses. And they've struck largely symbolic sites, not very, very clearly, important ones that would benefit them in the longer term context, militarily speaking. So for me, the Iranians have very few options left, which is why these different scenarios are ones that could quite quickly become a reality. No one wants war, but equally so many people doesn't want a nuclear Iran. And as we've seen, though, the path to preventing that is seemingly dangerously narrow. And if this had happened at any other time in history, we would have been overwhelmed with the global repercussions it had. But the fact it's happening at the same time that we have Ukraine, that we've had India and Pakistan exchanges just a month ago, illustrates just where we are with global uncertainty and instability. I find it, frankly, impossible to know how to make sense of all these things happening, and that we are living history. And, well, my intention here is to try to make sense of these and navigate it as best we can, as we all hope that peace can prevail in times of war and escalation. But if you enjoy this conversation, then do consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It really helps, and I'll be back with another one as soon as we get important development. And as always, well, you've either got to get playing or be played. Take care, everyone, and stay informed.